Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Alex Andreu, and I promise you the worm that consumed part of my brain has in no way affected my ability to host this podcast, at least in any way that you would notice. On today's show, Sunak tries yet another relaunch with a simple message, vote for me or it's World War III. But as more and more players enter that space, can another rightward lurch really save the Tories? Plus, Starmer has unveiled his plan on small boat crossings. But is the current obsessive argument about asylum preventing the UK from having an adult and increasingly urgent conversation about immigration more generally? Let's meet the panel. First up, it's the author of The Future of Trust and Oh God What Now regular, Ros Taylor. Hi, Ros.
Hello, Alex.
Ros, the UK has officially moved out of recession, according to the latest figures. Hurrah! Where are we seeing this growth, and is it likely to continue?
We're seeing a lot of growth in pipelines. Pipelines have absolutely boomed recently.
Okay.
Lots of them being
actual
built.
pipelines?
Yeah. More and more of them being manufactured. It's a boom business. Also, health and social care, which might not surprise you given the state of the NHS. And there's also been an increase in legal services and admin, which are things that the UK is particularly good at as well. The general feeling is that the economy will continue to grow, but very slowly, as in very, very slowly. The OECD predicted, I think, 0.4% growth in 2024, and that was a downgrade. And it says we might reach 1% by 2025. This is still going to be the lowest in the G7. So it's not looking really very rosy yet.
Yeah, the health stuff is quite interesting, right? Because it's been a growth area even when the UK was in recession. It sort of went up by a third last year. And it seems to me quite weird to be taking credit for the NHS being in such a state that loads more people have basically to pay privately.
Yes, and we'll have to see what effect throttling migration, of course, has on the ability of that sector to grow.
Yes. And joining Ros is a journalist specialising in social affairs, Hannah Fearn. Hello, Hannah.
Hello.
Hannah, the Birth Trauma Inquiry has released its report into maternity care. It makes for grim reading. Can you give listeners a flavour?
So 1 in 20 women are left with PTSD after undergoing their birth experience in this country. That's 30,000 a year going through traumatic experiences, many of them left with this very severe form of mental illness essentially afterwards. And the inquiry found a whole range of really horrific, really difficult to read stories about, what lives women and their babies have lived after difficult births, including chronic pain, bowel incontinence, people being unable to work afterwards because of their mental and physical health. And of course, the accounts of stillbirth, premature births that lead to, severe disability. And one of the common threads among all of this was that women weren't being listened to when they talked about their own physical symptoms, when they talked about their feelings about how their birth was going. And so although the PTSD is the real acute end of it, 1 in 3 women who give birth in the NHS are left with traumatic experiences. So, difficult memories and experiences that stay with them. And honestly, that's myself. My first birth was very difficult. I won't go into lots of detail, but it was difficult and long. And I was in hospital for 7 days afterwards. My baby was quite ill. And I had repeated flashbacks through that experience for 3 years. And then weirdly, they were completely erased by me having a very straightforward and lovely birth for my second. And so that just seemed to reset it for me. But I know women who've chosen not to have a second child because of this. And they're not people who would be counted in that 30,000 a year. So this is a huge problem in the NHS. And it was really good to see the report highlighting particularly as well that women from marginalised groups and particularly ethnic minority groups were most likely to feel they'd had, to have gone through a difficult experience, because that's a huge issue as well.
And maybe that ties to what you were saying about women not being listened
Absolutely
to.
that, yeah.
Maybe the crossover, being a woman of colour means you're even less likely
and
to
we
be
know
listened
that women of colour are more likely to have bad outcomes, more likely to have a stillbirth and so on. And it is that sense of just being completely pushed out from your own care and not being able to have any autonomy.
Yeah,
Really.
you just get belittled the whole time.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking as someone, who's not used to being belittled in any real context, and has had quite a lot of contact with the medical profession. But you do. There is this culture of absolutely patronising you, and it's really, and that's the least of it in terms of outcomes.
There's something uniquely vulnerable about being in the middle of labour in a process that you cannot stop. You cannot request it to stop. There's nothing you can do about it. It has to happen. And then to feel that you lose all your control within that and that you can't speak of how you feel. I had about halfway through my extremely long first labour, I had a woman, a midwife, tell me I wasn't coping. Now, that kind of language, when you're in the middle of that process, is incredibly unuseful, shall we say.
Now, before we get started, may I draw your attention to a bumper week in the Podmaster cinematic universe. Origin Story is back for a 5th season starting this Wednesday, 15th of May. Ian Dunt and Dorian Linsky will be taking more deep dives into political concepts and personalities, even buildings, that are perhaps a little too misunderstood. And they're starting with a double bill on George Orwell. Patreon people get part 2 a week early at the same time as part 1, so there's no better time to sign up. Plus, don't miss American Friction, our new podcast where we count down to the nightmare of the US presidential election. It's out every Friday with Jarv, Chris Jones and Nikki McCann Ramirez of Rolling Stone magazine, and it's now officially an Apple Top 12 podcast. And Ros's brilliant history of post-war Britain, Jam Tomorrow, reaches its season finale this week. We are already working on the next season, with an edition on how women's magazines shaped their readers' lives. If you like Oh God What Now, you'll love those shows. Get them all on your favourite apps, and there's links to all of them in the show notes, so you needn't spend a single moment of your day not listening to the sound of Podmasters. Now, Sunak took to the stage on Monday with yet another relaunch. His I Have a Nightmare speech had a pretty confused message. He complained about Labour judging Tories on their 14-year record, but suggested that record is brilliant. He argued for tolerance and bringing people together, but seems to think the country is swarming with extremists, putting everyone from actual terrorists to trans rights advocates, Scottish nationalists, and anyone he deems woke in the same basket. He also suggested that Labour are too negative about the future, but also that we are on the verge of World War III or the zombie apocalypse. But as the Elphicke defection reduces the Tory majority from 80 MPs in 2019 to 38 now, Nadhim Zahawi becomes the 64th Conservative to say he will not contest his seat. Can another lurch to the right stem the bleeding? And with mega brains like Dominic Cummings and Matthew Goodwin hinting they're about to launch their own parties, has there been a fundamental miscalculation simply of where most voters are? Now, Ros, can we start with his extraordinary speech that Sunak made on Monday? His pitch was that Labour are looking at the past, while he's a visionary. Is it smart to say, don't look at our record? Which is effectively what he was saying.
It's always difficult to fight an election when you've been in power for 14 years. And this is the kind of thing that happens. It was a very odd speech because it was really trying to have it all ways. So it was trying to frame Labour and Keir Starmer specifically as a danger to national security, but also himself as a visionary. It was all I. It was a lot of I in this speech. Who has the ideas and the creativity to enable Britain to prosper in a world of artificial intelligence, etc., etc. And I think it was also trying to take on the Labour securonomics idea, which is one of the more appealing parts about Labour's prospectus as we know it. Arguing that you can trust the Tories to keep you, that you have to trust the Tories to keep you safe, and that it's a dangerous world and only the Tories can protect you from it, all at the same time while taking advantage of all these marvellous opportunities. And can you really do all those things in one speech? I don't think you can. And we heard the kind of thing that Tony Blair used to say occasionally, but which sounded very very out of touch at the moment. There was one bit where he wanted us to imagine a world where choosing an NHS appointment at the hospital you wanted was as easy as picking out what to watch on iPlayer. And you think, well, actually, I just like the appointment. I like the appointment, at some point in the next 6 months. And if you could just get that basic stuff right, then I will worry about making it as easy as it is to do on iPlayer. And that felt peculiarly out of touch with what most people are thinking.
Yes, because the danger is that if you try to do all of that in one speech, you do nothing.
Yeah.
And that was what was striking to me, that there was like no narrative arc at all. I left the speech thinking, what just happened?
Yeah.
What is he talking about? Is he continuity or is he change? Is he defending the record of the last 14 years or eschewing it? Is he a visionary or is he continuity?
Exactly.
Anyway, maybe that's just me. He also said, as I mentioned, that these are dangerous times, terrorists, extremists trying to foment chaos, racists, anti-Semites, anti-Muslims, and they proceeded to put gender activists, cancel culture, and even Scottish nationalists in the same bracket. I mean, will this bring any new voters to him, or is it just a defensive action to sort of scare his base away from voting reform?
I mean, this is just a nod, really, to the phrases that will ensure he gets lots of favourable coverage on GB News. It's just throwing out those usual things. But it is very strange to make an apparently serious speech, which was billed as a very serious, scary speech about the changes in the next 5 years being bigger than the changes in the last 30, and to flag that up and talk about the threat from Russia, and then to dilute that message by throwing in all this culture war stuff. It's almost like, well, why do that? If you're going to do the fear narrative, and if you're going to make that argument, don't get caught up in cancel culture and Scottish nationalists, because quite frankly, those are not remotely in the same league. And that was, I think, one of the strangest things about it.
And actually, they detract from it in a weird way. They make you into, you're trying to present yourself as this big figure that will respond to the big issues of the day, and you're actually making yourself quite small and petty. And all of it was delivered with this whining, why won't you love me tone.
I mean, for me, the content, the chaos of the content really demonstrated how bad his team are at politics. It was just a bad political speech for exactly those reasons. It undermined itself at every turn.
He's meant to be a genius, isn't he? I mean, I guess you can't polish a turd. Well. Hannah, one thing that emerged pretty clearly from the local elections, and both Labour and Tory activists were saying that, is that most people, when you knock on their door, they're no longer listening to anything the Tories have to say, right? Is activating fear actually quite a good way to get voters' attention?
Yeah, I think it's, the fear element was about two things. One is about trying to scare people into continuity government, into trying to make that link with the Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn era of Labour, that whatever you think of us now, we're still better than the alternative. That's the kind of straightforward. But I think that there's another side of it, which is much more kind of blatant in electioneering, which is essentially trying to attract attention away from Starmer, who had a very good weekend, despite the Elphicke furore, Natalie Elphicke, and all of the discord about that. He nevertheless had a really good weekend on cover of Scrapping the Rwanda Policy, which I know we'll come back to later. And the papers what was so interesting was seeing, this should have been a bad weekend for Labour. We went into it with the Elphicke story dominating, and we also had the leak to the Sunday Times of this information about her backstory.
We'll return to that.
Which we'll return to. But and yet, Starmer still managed to make it all about him. And so he had to do something to get the attention back. And what can you do except frighten people? That's kind of all there is left.
Yeah. There seems to be a consensus after that local election that Sunak is now safe until the election, right? But several polls last week uniformly showed a 2-point opening of the gap, even post-Elphicke stuff, in favour of Labour. I mean, is there really no low number that will spook enough Tory MPs?
Honestly, I don't think there is now, because anybody who is seriously interested in rebuilding the Conservative Party after the election isn't going to want to stand forward now and, put themselves as the electoral candidate. They don't want to be the person leading the party into a disastrous election. And we've seen the attempts.
But surely if anyone stands now, their pitch will be, we're going to get a spanking.
Yes, but why
I'm going to try and minimize it and then rebuild the party. They're not going to take thinking that I'll resign after the election, right?
No, but it's a very unattractive proposition for you personally as a politician. Why would you want to do that with your career? It's much more compelling in an arc of your own story to let it happen and then rebuild yourself. Plus, no seats are safe really now, are they?
Yeah.
So you could get to the point where the person who stands could then actually potentially even lose their seat.
Yeah, but less. I mean, Mordaunt is quite likely to lose her seat, for example. And if she was leader, if she were leader, she's less likely to lose her seat. So that could be also a strategy for her to have her pop at leadership while she still can and preserve her seat.
I think because they would have to call an election pretty quickly. It's impossible to say they have any electoral mandate with a third unelected prime minister, because they'd have to go very fast to a general election. I think it's such an unattractive idea that nobody will want to be the one to do it.
Over the weekend, of course, you had the One Nation Tories basically beginning to coalesce around Andy Street and saying, let's get him a safe, in inverted commas, seat somewhere in the West Midlands where people have heard of him, and then he can take over and make it into a lovely, centre-right party again. And, well, if it works. But
I'd be all for it.
When I mentioned something about that on X, and people, Twitter, whatever we want to call it these days, it fairly pointed out to me, a number of people jumped on and said, he did support Liz Truss. We can't really claim he's a centrist.
Yeah, well, sure, but there were two of them. I mean, Ros, on that Elphicke defection, it caused a lot of controversy from the moment it happened on both sides. Was it a miscalculation by Starmer, do you think?
On reflection, it was probably more trouble than it was worth. I think he will look back on it and think, oh, maybe we should have said no. But now that it's happened and that he has made it clear that he's not going to drop her despite any of these new revelations, I think the whole thing will begin to peter out shortly. Essentially, it sent the message that you can be very worried about small boats and now trust Labour, which was the intended message and was squarely aimed at people who might have been flirting with reform because they are so worried about immigration. And that was an immensely valuable message for potential Labour voters. And as so often, when it's that message, it really, really pissed off many Labour MPs, and that is going to happen again and again.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say at the basis of it is this strange thing that, when a party needs basically a 20-point swing to get into power, which is what Labour need from the 2019 election, actually even more, it's like a 26-point swing.
There's a bit of there's just good debate about that. I mean, some pollsters argue that they're piling up votes in the right places so that actually they don't need that bigger swing anymore.
Sure. Look, the point is when you need a big result, basically, the basic calculation, the main route for getting there is to convince people who voted for the other side to now vote for you. And it seems to me that a lot of Labour people find that quite unpalatable. They don't want to forgive people who voted Tory in 2019.
And they don't like to think that anybody who could think of voting reform could vote Labour. But there are people like that out there.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, there's also seems to be like a third wave reaction now, right? So the first wave was like, wow, what just happened? Massive sort of coup de théâtre. The second wave reaction was backlash against Labour. She shouldn't be in your party. There now seems to be a third wave where there's loads of stuff coming out, but it is only now being briefed. And it seems to be bouncing back on the Tories because, like, the Buckland stuff.
They've been sitting on that for a long time.
You were Justice Secretary at the time, and you didn't say anything for 4 years. So now you want Labour to take responsibility for something that happened between Tory MPs and was hushed up by Tory MPs 3 years later. Are we beginning to see a sort of swing of the pendulum back now?
Yeah, I think we are. And to be honest, while the Buckland revelations were interesting, they are really an extension of what we knew already. We knew she'd done some inappropriate lobbying. We knew she'd used House of Commons notepaper to do that. And she was suspended very briefly from the Commons as a result. We knew, and she knows, that she made some very bad choices in the period when she was trying to defend her ex-husband. And this is another aspect of that. I don't think it will have blown anyone away, the weekend's exclusives. It's a bit more of what we knew already.
Hannah, part of the problem seems to be that the defection took Labour people by surprise.
Yeah.
Should he have rolled the pitch better on that, or is it better to ask forgiveness rather than permission? Because
I'm definitely
on one hand, I think he should have let people know so it wasn't such a shock. And then I think if he had done that, they'd have gone, no.
Yeah, I am very much, in all things, I'm very much in the proceed until apprehended camp. and I think that I'm not sure why this is anyone else's business in Labour apart from the leader and the defecting MP. And I do think that, especially now these extra revelations, although as Ros is right, they build on what we already knew, but now we know that there was this aggressive lobbying going on behind the scenes that the Tories have been sitting on. I actually think it would be quite profitable for Starmer to now suspend her pending investigation, because not only does it look like he's willing to be collegiate and bring all people into this new Labour Party, he's also willing to take action where the Tories have failed. That's what I'd do if I was him.
But he should have done that on Sunday if he was going to do that.
Now.
You can't hang around and then do it because you come under pressure. That's giving in, and that's not the Starmer vibe.
What about Zahawi announcing he will step down? Were you at all surprised?
Not at all surprised. And I don't think he'll be the last big hitter either. It's just a slow drip until the election. I mean, he's in his mid-50s now. And I know people have talked about, they're running in fear of a Portillo moment. I don't think it's as much that. I think it's that if you're in your mid-50s, you've only got, say, 15 years of your career ahead of you, are you going to spend a decade of that in irrelevance on the backbenches? No. You're going to step away and do something else with your time. And I don't think it's the last one. The rumours about Jeremy Hunt are still going around. Yeah. Although the closer we get, the less likely that is. There was a story a couple
of months ago.
Yeah, it was just before Christmas.
Downing Street asked them to stagger their... No, but do you remember seeing that?
Yeah.
There was a story that Downing Street
don't all go
asked
at once,
them,
please.
don't all announce you're not standing at once, kind of... coordinated a little bit.
I, for one, was astonished that Zahawi made that moving statement last week that he was standing down. And today it emerged that he has a chairmanship for an organisation called Very, which he is taking up next month.
Oh, isn't that nice?
Who could have thought it?
Isn't that nice?
It's extraordinary.
I mean, the rebuilding will take so long, but I don't think any of the people who are intimately connected to Sunak or Truss or Johnson are going to be a part of it. So I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Like I said, this brings a number of Tory MPs standing down at the next election that we know of so far to 64. There are some big names in there too. Sajid Javid, Theresa May, Alok Sharma. Can we read anything into this pattern? I mean, does it correspond with previous elections where a party thought they would do very badly, or is it just a function of being in power for a long time?
I'm just amazed that more of them aren't standing down, to be honest. I mean, it's you naturally want to jump before you're pushed. You don't want to be searching for a job when you've just lost your parliamentary seat. That's not a great time. And the bigger the name you are, the easier it should be to line up another gig. So, yeah, it amazes me that more of them aren't. But I suppose they have to try and put some sort of lid on it, or it looks like it looks like rats, not just rats and sinking ship, but
lemmings, everything.
Yes, everything. I can't think of an appropriate metaphor, but it would be if even more of them decide.
I think rats from a sinking ship is an appropriate metaphor. I don't think
if we bring in the Titanic as well.
Dominic Cummings, our old friend, he thinks it's time for a new party to replace the Tory party and seems to think he's got the answer. What's he been saying?
Oh, Jesus Christ. Yeah, he's running focus groups. Yeah, focus groups, because that's how powerful his vision is. So
that's a break with the establishment, if ever I saw one. Do you know what I mean? If you wanna smash Westminster, do a few focus groups.
Well, it's currently called the Startup Party, or
God.
TSP, but apparently this is just a placeholder name, which is being workshopped at the moment. And we don't know a lot at the moment. He's apparently said he wants it to be filled with entrepreneurs, NHS workers, and military veterans. Now, there is nothing wrong with any of those people, but it is odd to prescribe who should be a member of your party before you actually talk about what your party stands for. So what realistically do we know about what a Cummings party would stand for? We know that he is very keen to abandon support for Ukraine. He believes it is a lost cause. He believes it is a needless provocation of Russia. So undoubtedly that would form a plank of it. We know that
he'd focus group it and see how he does, I imagine.
We know that he wants a great deal more executive power and less legal interference, as he sees it, in what the government is doing.
That sounds democratic.
Beyond that, it's hard to say.
Matt Goodwin.
Another one.
He's also planning to launch his own party.
Yes.
Too. What is his...
No name so
What
far.
is his pitch?
Well, his pitch, you'll be surprised to hear this. He says people are utterly sick of the big parties, desperately looking for an alternative. In his words, I want to allow the people themselves to provide that alternative. But then he lists the things that he thinks particularly concern the people. That's woke and gender ideology, anti-immigration, the rise of Islamism.
No one's catering for that.
Literally, I don't know if you heard Sunak on Monday.
I mean, nobody seems to be catering for that.
One really annoying thing that I just feel I need to flag up is that he puts the rise of Islamism globally down to young Muslims. So there's a dose of intergenerational warfare as well as just racism and cultural war.
I mean,
he's also my age, so he's still young. How can he be doing this? It frustrates me.
Do you think he applied to reform and was turned down?
Well,
no.
There's more. There's more. So he calls what he's talking about the real centre, right? But it seems that he's completely ignoring the polls, because if you look for Labour, who actually are providing what I would argue is the real centre, they're actually ahead.
Yeah.
So the idea...
there's another centre.
Yeah. He thinks that the age demographics are really important. So he believes that Zoomers are used to this political volatility that we're living through. They don't remember the kind of Blair years. They expect a certain punchiness to their politics and can tolerate this kind of what I think is incredibly divisive chat. And he also thinks that the centre, as you or I might think of it, can't cope with what's coming down coming down the track on the geopolitical stage. And that our institutions are breaking because of wokeness, and therefore they can't cope with it. Now, I obviously disagree with all of that, but he strongly believes that that younger people will be attracted to this kind of strong, polemical idea, and that is the centre now.
I mean, he's bidding to be Geert Wilders, or
he says that he's going
whoever.
to set up his party when he gets 100,000 subscribers. So that sounds like a real basis to change.
His subscribers, as in
on his Substack.
Okay.
So this is literally politics by. So
it's literally give me money.
I think what you're seeing with Matt Goodwin, who, of course...
I think I'm seeing a lot with Matt Goodwin that cannot be captured in one conversation.
I mean, it's interesting. This is a guy who's been on a journey. He once co-authored a book with Rob Ford, and they have since fallen out to an extraordinary degree, because they basically both studied the far right. And subsequently, Matt Goodwin has
when I'll have a slice of that.
Well, but he comes from a very different. I mean, he has an intellectual hinterland, and I think he is instinctively uncomfortable with some aspects of the populism of reform, for example. But the corollary of that is it probably won't be in the slightest bit popular.
Final question. I mean, do these sort of moves involve a miscalculation as to where the political space in UK politics is at the moment? It seems to me it's an increasing number of people trying to compete with an increasingly small segment of voters. And in the meantime, Starmer's like, yeah, I'll have all this.
Yeah, I think
I'll welcome everyone else.
I think it indicates a fundamental inability to realise that people have grey areas. Like, there are a lot of people in this country who actually probably, are on board with the idea that woke is running everything and that, gender ideology is a problem and so on. But they're going to vote Labour at the next election because they are concerned about the NHS. They're very concerned about the cost of living. They've been incredibly disappointed with Johnson's handling of the pandemic. Millions of reasons. They want to see their children's schools improve. The idea that people package up their thoughts in this coherent ideology is remote for most people's lives. And that is why Starmer is hoovering people up.
Yeah. What do you think, Ros?
Yeah, I think people are just not in the mood for experimentation. And that's why Goodwin and Cummings are backing the wrong horse.
Yeah.
People, there isn't that sense of fundamental security that allowed a lot of people to vote for Brexit in 2016 because they felt life's not great, but nor were they afraid of shaking things up. And I think now there is a wariness and a weariness that makes people really reluctant to impose massive changes on the way Britain works because, let's face it, those experiments have failed.
Yeah.
They just want stuff to work again.
And also they demand so much energy and such a big spotlight. And I think the vast majority of people actually want government to be something that, on the whole, just happens in the background.
Just to go away.
Not these personalities that are all, look at me, look at my brilliant idea.
And I also think that's why Sunak's wrong about this fear pitch, because I don't think people are interested in having their, inner fears stoked. They want some kind of pragmatism and a bit of positivity and some kind of, it's all right, we'll sort this out.
Next up, time to choose our hero and villain of the week. Who's this week's Switzerland and who's this week's Netherlands? How about you, Ros?
Well, my hero or heroine of the week is formerly of this parish, Aisha Hazarika.
Oh.
She joined the House of Lords as a peer at the weekend, and it was just refreshing. It was very refreshing to see a woman of colour joining the Lords. Obviously, that's happened before, but she said, I think she posted on the day she was going in, I'm just going in to join the Lords, and I just slapped on a fresh HRT patch. And,
Nice.
Aisha has been great and really very groundbreaking in the way she has been happy to talk about HRT, not in a kind of you must get it or, a kind of wellness way, but just, straight, this is what's going on with me. And that's actually been very, very refreshing.
Villain?
My villain is a Tory MP, I'm afraid. Sorry, a bit predictable. Maria Caulfield, the Lewis MP. She lied about 15-minute cities, essentially, during the local election campaign. She claimed that the Lib Dems and Greens wanted to charge you for driving more than 15 minutes away from your home. Now, you can argue...
She didn't, did she?
Yeah, you can argue that anyone who fell for such an absurd piece of electioneering, would deserve what they got. But on the other hand, it was a barefaced lie, and you really shouldn't get away with that kind of stuff.
Not just a barefaced lie, but a barefaced lie that taps into a massive conspiracy theory. Oh, so dangerous.
How about you, Hannah?
Okay, so my hero is the charity Shelter, who have put out an amazing kind of campaigning video about basically bigging up being brought up in social housing. And it features Suggs and various other people, some famous, some not, just really making the case for how their housing stability, being brought up in social housing, made them who they are. And they've done better than almost every other organisation who actually builds and manages social housing in telling that story. And I just think it was a really good bit of lobbying and nice to see it.
Yeah, very good. And villain?
Villain of the week is Esther McVeigh, another Tory classic, who is banning, in her words, random lanyards that civil servants wear with their name tags on and so on. And, this is really frustrating because people have taken it, including me, to mean things like rainbow lanyards to, around LGBT support.
Well, it is what it means, isn't it?
Yeah, and sunflower lanyards, which demonstrate a hidden disability. And we've spent years trying to make diversity in the civil service an asset. And now here comes this. It's so regressive. The idea that somebody can't wear a rainbow lanyard to just, be proud of their sexuality at work, why not? I mean, it makes me really cross. It's classic lowest common denominator
strong
stuff.
entries. I think there's going to be something for everyone this week. Okay. So I'm going to give Maria Caulfield Villain of the Week, because that is just, wrong to just make shit up and then use it to campaign. But I am going to give Esther McVey Dickhead of the Week, a new category just because I think what she did does not even rise to the intelligence level of villain.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think it has to be something a bit more sophisticated to justify Villain of the Week. And then we absolutely love Aisha, obviously, but Shelter's work is completely amazing. And I think if Aisha were here and I told her that Hero of the Week was between her and Shelter, she would say, fuck that, I want this. And so on that basis, Aisha is my Hero of the Week.
Fair enough.
Small boat crossings are the perfect example of an issue that has been inflated, if you pardon the pun, as a problem by Conservatives for years, with short-term political gain without any long-term thought as to whether they had any actual solution. But many see it as displacement activity, as a way of having a difficult small argument in place of an impossibly huge one. But that more difficult debate on immigration in general just looms ever larger. It isn't helped by those who offer spurious solutions that involve no trade-offs, chief among them the notion that the UK can be a country that simultaneously attracts every Nobel Prize winner, who also happens to be a millionaire and has no family, while also being generally xenophobic and hostile to migrants. To paraphrase the playwright Max Frisch, you may just want workers, but what you'll get instead is people. Hannah, Starmer presented his own plan for dealing with small boats crossings last week. What is a general outline and tone of that?
Okay, so he's going to scrap Rwanda and use the money, the 75 million that's been allocated by the government, brackets, I think it'll end up, if it went ahead, costing a lot more than that. But anyway, to launch a new border security command, which would include hundreds of new specialist investigators and apparently new counter-terror powers that they're going to legislate for, to deal with the criminal gangs that lead to smuggling, basically, people smuggling. And the idea is that all that money goes into the fight on the front line, both, in France and across on the Channel, but elsewhere as well. That there'll be money for tackling humanitarian crises at their source as well. So probably that suggests that a Starmer government would put more a focus on aid budgets. There would be...
Because a lot of the aid budget at the moment, like a third of it, is going towards paying for hotels.
Yes, so they also say...
For asylum claimants who haven't been processed.
Yeah, so coming to that, they also say they would end hotel use. Now, obviously, that's popular on both the left and the right, because the right can't bear that we're spending so much money on hotels, because the word hotel makes it sound like they're being put up in the Ritz, when actually it's horrific life living in in hotels. But and the left doesn't like it because it's so horrific, and it's no way to build a sustainable community. So they say they're going to abandon hotels altogether. They're going to use the funding that they're saving on that to clear the asylum backlog, speed up returns to safe countries where that's appropriate, and put more caseworkers into processing so that we get the right outcomes. There's so much in this, but ultimately it's about spending less on the stuff that people don't like, the kind of populist stuff around hotels, and spending more money on aid and criminal justice to break through the international gangs that do lead to the amount of people coming across, risking their lives because they're sold that it is safer than it actually is. Ultimately, I think the big headline, and this is what they got all of that good press for at the weekend, frankly, probably better, I would imagine, than Starmer was expecting to get, was that we will just drop this. Not one plane will go off as soon as I'm in power. I will not allow people to be sent to Rwanda. It's not an appropriate scheme. Not only is it a waste of money, it's also unsafe, and it won't happen under my watch. And that clear line is something that I think a lot of people have been waiting for. And it really does highlight waste of money that the whole project has been. So it was a good weekend for Starmer in that sense, despite all the
And he also
stuff.
took quite a strong stance on sort of human rights and
he
being
did.
part of international agreements and that.
So new agreements with France and other countries on returns, and also talking about family reunion as well, making sure that people were resettled where they have family, even if that's elsewhere in Europe, which is a humane response.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting that at the moment the people who really dislike Starmer and the left of the Labour Party will say boo to anything he says, but on this one, all they said was he's lying.
Yeah.
So it's
but I don't, sometimes I think that's true when you're coming up to an election campaign. On this matter, I don't think he's lying.
Yeah, on the human rights stuff, for sure. I think that's in his DNA after so many years. Ros, the only thing that has had some success for the Tory government is that deal with Albania. Shouldn't the focus be on pursuing orthodox returns deals like that? Or are they just really difficult to strike?
Well, they're not just really difficult to strike, they're usually impossible to strike. I mean, Albania was quite an easy win. The problem is that the top 5 countries of the migrants who've arrived on small boats this year so far are Vietnam, Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iran and Syria. Now, you won't be surprised that those are not among the 57 countries that Britain has deemed safe for removals, and I can't really see, with the possible exception of Vietnam, that they ever could be. Maybe we could strike a deal with Vietnam, but what's in it for Vietnam? Not entirely clear.
Several Tory MPs, presumably prompted by CCHQ, they tweeted with pride a graph showing a sharp drop in applications for health and care sector visas. I mean, the combined vacancies are 500,000 in health and care. Is there any plan at work now, or is it just fewer foreigners at any cost? Is it just reduce numbers, I don't care what happens, in a year when we literally have no one in the care sector to work there?
In a year when hopefully it will be Keir Starmer's problem. Yeah, it's basically kicking the problem down the road, because what you need to do in order to try and help the sector survive without migrant workers is to make health and social care a better job, more attractive, better paid, proper career paths, good training, more respect in society. And they haven't done really any of those things. And that's why the Nursing Times reported last week that there had been an 83% decline in applications for
depressing.
Health and social care.
I mean, that's catastrophic, because it was already, like I said, really struggling.
Yeah, exactly. And you've got to think that they are just kicking it into the autumn so that it becomes Labour's problem.
But it's really baffling to me that they think that that's a successful electoral strategy, because...
well, they don't. That's the point, isn't it? They don't think they will win.
True.
But then what happens is Labour has to step in and, allow those care workers in. And so 1 year in, they'll point to the increase
and say it's gone up.
Say, look, we told you they just opened the door.
But people can already
everyone.
see through this. So for one of my one of the publications I write for, I'm doing quite a lot of sort of extended conversations with people all around the country, and I've been speaking to a lot of people working and living in Northumberland, and about their intentions to vote and their thoughts on various issues. And when it comes to immigration, even up in Northumberland, they're talking about, the lack of people available post-Brexit to work in a load of sectors, including care and others. And so people are actually noticing this already, and they're frustrated that Brexit has led to this shortage. So the idea that the Tories think that they're going to win votes on this matter is baffling.
I've also heard that the Home Office is deliberately going slow on these visa applications as well.
I mean, that is just disgraceful, so cynical. What's the overview of public opinion in the UK, Hannah?
Okay,
more generally.
Yeah, I dug up some really interesting stats on this. So if you stay with me for a minute while I go through them, because I think they're really interesting. So overarching, in April 2023, so that is a year ago now, half of people, 52%, thought that immigration numbers should be reduced. But the level of opposition, really varied by the type of question. And actually far fewer people, only around a third, 32%, said that immigration was a bad or very bad thing. So there was also evidence overall that that attitudes, and it's from multiple sources, that attitudes have started to soften over the years. So interestingly, and attitudes in the UK are also more positive than our European neighbours, which actually that surprised me, because much of Europe has done a bit of a better job around the kind of the migration crisis in those the years where we had everybody coming across the Mediterranean. Now, more recent data suggests much more interesting stuff politically. So people are pissed off, basically, with the government. According to the Immigration Attitudes Tracker, which is an Ipsos and British Future thing, 69% of the public are dissatisfied. Only 9% are satisfied with what the government are doing. And this is the highest level of unhappiness ever recorded since they started this data gathering. So you have to ask yourself, given that, what is pushing Rwanda through all about? You've done this, and people are still, at this point, deeply unsatisfied with what you've done.
It's exactly what I said in the intro, right? They have made this a massive issue in voters' minds and then failed singularly to address it in any way.
So coming to that, 53% of current Conservative supporters say that this is important in how they're going to decide their vote in the next election. Only half, 53%. And it's a number 3 issue after the NHS and the cost of living. So it's not even Conservatives' top motivating factor. For Labour voters, it ranks 12th. So in terms of converting these people who are floating towards Starmer now, this is not working.
My impression, and this is just an instinctive thing, is that when many on the right say controlled migration, what they really want is zero. Right? And when many on the left think that discussing the subject is somehow feeding xenophobia, they're dreaming about a sort of open borders future that maybe somewhere down the line, wouldn't it be lovely? Is there room for real discussion in between those two segments that want really very different things?
Both of those extremes that you described there are very unrealistic. So people might hope for them deep down, but
they're popular.
Well, but they're both popular.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the Brexit thing. It's like you either have one vision of your nation or another, and you kind of fall into those camps. But I do think that there is some hope for agreement, particularly on, I think, some of these, the kind of zero immigration thing is it harps back to that nostalgia. We were talking a few weeks ago on the podcast about nostalgia online and why it's so popular. And I think it harps back to that, and a lot of it is basically aging out as politics, engagement with politics, like refreshes with millennial vote and so on. We know that most people under 50 have no motivation to vote Conservatives, and that zero immigration idea, I think, which is attached to the right of the Conservative Party, is I think it's aging away. And I do think as a result of that, the pragmatism around things like the care sector that we were talking about, some of those service jobs that are so essential to our economy and are struggling at the moment, I think that there's room for agreement, but it does require this government to be swept away, this whole rhetoric around Rwanda and deportations to be swept away. And I really hope that the phrase "stop the boats" disappears after the election as well, because it's a demonising shorthand.
Ros, Japan made a clear post-World War decision for near cultural isolation, basically, over the economic benefits of immigration. How did that work out?
Well, it's not working out particularly well because Japan has an aging population. And the question is who is going to look after them. There was a feeling for a while that it might be robots in some way, but as you, in particular, I think, Alex, are all too aware, a robot is not an adequate substitution for a human being when it comes to caring for people. It's interesting looking at how, you can ask which countries have made the right choices on migration and which have made the wrong ones. And I don't think you can really say that anyone, particularly in Europe, has made the right choices. I think there's tensions everywhere. And often for quite different reasons. But One of the things that's worth clinging on to is that Britain is actually really good at integrating migrants. We are actually better than France or Germany at ensuring that, especially in the second generation and third generation, migrants are doing as well, if not in many cases better, than white Britons. And that is actually something to celebrate. We are getting some things right, partly because we are good at letting people work. We don't let asylum seekers work, but we're good at letting people work, and that is usually the route out of poverty. And so what you've got to ask yourself there is, where are the pressure points that we can see that people on the right and the far right will seize upon and claim are due to immigration pressures, and what can we do to address those? How can we preempt that? And I think housing. Is an obvious example. Health, yeah, exactly.
Hannah, can immigration be controlled? Ultimately, I mean, if large swathes of the world become uninhabitable, either because of climate change or war and instability, is there a fence that will stop millions of people?
I mean, obviously not, yeah.
So should the focus be on the push factors a lot more?
We need to be much better at planning around the push factors. I think an important step in migration policy, a kind of maturation of it, would be accepting that we don't know exactly what and where those push factors will always be. So Ukraine was a sudden driver, which should have been predictable, but wasn't predicted. That when it suddenly happened, we weren't prepared for that, but we still managed to cope with that and to play our moral part in that. So I think that is a good example of how we could be better at future planning. There's one example of how we responded quickly when necessary. And I think it does require some careful thinking across party boundaries, and at the moment we're not in a position to do that, but post-election, maybe.
Where the jobs are, you see, is really quite predictable.
That's true.
And you want a government that is quite good at predicting that, because actually, if a factory opens and 200,000 people move to Milton Keynes, it doesn't make a difference if they're Polish or if they're from Birmingham, unless you go into the public services for that area and boost them because you know what's about to happen, they will collapse.
But interestingly enough, Ros pointed out how there are, some white British communities aren't doing as well as immigrant communities in the same areas. We're really, really bad on social mobility. And one of the reasons we're bad on social mobility, particularly for white Britons, is we don't have an industrial strategy.
Yeah.
We don't have any industrial strategy. And as a result of that, we end up with all these problems where there's sudden pressure in areas because we haven't planned for how we're going to grow our industries and where the workforce is going to come from. All of this is a kind of a culmination of years of poor government.
Yeah.
That's all we can say, I think.
Ros, one final question. I mean, the demographic calculation seems to be quite merciless, okay? Developed nations either have to welcome more immigration or produce a lot more babies, and that has implications for women's rights, or resign to a catastrophic decline in living standards, or accept there is no such thing as retirement anymore. You work to the grave, or a combination of some of those. What do you think will give ultimately? Because at some point, those things will become impossible to ignore.
Yeah, I think working longer is the obvious one because it's probably the easiest in terms of the government encouraging people who are healthy enough to work longer. But I don't think we need to be quite so pessimistic as you imply in some ways. I think it's a question of ensuring that everyone already in the UK has as good a chance as possible of working for as long as possible. And part of that, a huge part of that, is actually fixing the NHS so that all the people sitting on waiting lists or with mental health problems or all the other things that the state currently isn't helping them with can be helped back into the workforce. And then we have, frankly, less need for migrant workers. We also need to make the tough jobs that migrants often do, like childcare and care and so on, more attractive, more better paid is part of it, but also just more like a career and less like something that you would rather someone came in from outside to do rather than you did yourself. And actively respect and honour those things, which we're not very good at doing. We seem to kind of gesture towards that during the pandemic. We didn't really get there. We need to enforce the employment law properly so we don't tolerate illegal working, and that's part of it as well, so that people, when they have a job, it's a proper job. It's not a insecure, badly paid job. And I think, as I say, the people who are already here need certainty, and it's particularly, I think, the case for, say, Ukrainians. Imagine you're a Ukrainian, you're a Ukrainian woman, and you arrived, say, 2 years ago. And now you haven't really got certainty yet about your future. You don't really know whether the UK is going to let you stay. And so you're probably trapped in some sort of part-time job, maybe something like cleaning, something like that, because you don't know about the future, and you probably can't get the funding, for example, to train to do a more demanding, better paid, convert what you're doing.
The language.
Yeah, you need to be clear when you let people in, do it properly. That was the big mistake that Germany made. They had this guest worker idea where they thought that people would come to Germany and then they would go back to Turkey, and then they didn't. And they never had, they didn't have full rights as Germans. They weren't proper citizens, and that led to all kinds of tensions. We need to avoid making that mistake.
We've reached the end of the show, so it's time for escape routes. What activities have taken us outside the political mania and depression cycle that is Westminster? Ros?
I went to see The Fall Guy on Sunday. It was so much fun. It's such a great movie. I don't understand why it's not doing better at the box office than it is. I mean, obviously it's a bit basic and, but it's got...
We like basic.
It's got everything. It's got comedy. It's got stunts. It's got romance. It's brilliant. It's got also an array of references to other movies. There's like 5-second bits where actually they're referencing Die Hard there. That's really clever. And loads of Miami Vice piss takes as well, which is really funny. And it's a great movie. I highly recommend it. Go and see it. It's brilliant.
You're smiling very broadly while saying this, which is the best recommendation possible. How about you, Hannah?
Okay, well, I've got one serious one and one silly one. So seriously, I know I'm a decade late to this, in keeping with my usual timing on things, but I've just started watching The Americans, which is this 6-series TV series based around 2 Soviet spies who are embedded in the US during the Cold War, and it's absolutely great. Now, I've got a long way to go because it's 6 series. I'm only in the first, but it's really, really great. That the kind of period detail is fantastic. Script writing's good, and it's quite a lot of fun as well. There's a lot of action in it. So yeah, highly recommend if you also, like me, have slept on this for 10 years.
What is it on?
Oh, that is a good question.
Yeah, okay.
It's on Channel 4. But silly thing, I love my trash reality as well.
I do.
I've just binged the 3rd series of Selling the OC on Netflix, which is very, if you like that kind of rubbish for a bit of light-hearted entertainment, it's really good. Episode 7 of 8 in that series is an absolute classic of the genre, with the kind of will they, won't they, 2 of the characters, Alex Hall and Tyler. Anyway, if you've watched any of it and you're silly like me, go and watch that because you'll enjoy it.
Fantastic. So I want to say something about what's not been my escape route this last weekend, and that's Eurovision. I always love to watch it. I watch it with friends. We tweet about it. And this year, the whole thing felt so entirely sullied that it sucked out all the joy and fun out of it. And I didn't even watch it in the end. So sort it out.
I must admit, I just can't get that excited about the quality of the songs. I mean, they're just usually so shit.
Well,
sorry,
that's kind of the point. But also,
because Alex is right here,
point.
so I don't want to get into a bit I don't want to deflate from your point. Yeah. But you're very wrong on that. We'll have to come back to this at some point.
Happy to debate at any time.
Topic 2 next week. And that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? Thank you, Ros.
Thank you.
And thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Thursday for our Patreon backers and Friday morning for everyone else. And we're looking forward to seeing everyone at our sold-out live show in Islington next Monday. It's Grim Up North London with Ros, Dorian, me, and special guest Jan Ravens doing her Liz Truss. If you'd like to help keep us firing on all cylinders, then you can support us on Patreon for just £3 a month. It doesn't sound like much, but it really does go a long way to helping keep Oh God What Now well and truly alive. Thanks for listening. See you next time. And now for the traditional shout-outs to those lovely people who've been generous enough to back the podcast on Patreon.
Hello, huge thanks and a big shout from me to new backers Tim Pinder, Mags, John Logan and Miranda Pallen.
Many thanks from me for your support and generosity to Gerald Moore, Anton Meso, Angus Sutherland and Matthew Stevenson.
And finally, hello from me. Your contribution is truly appreciated to Nikki Parker, Ruth Smith, Lynn Thomas and returning supporter Thomas Gaston. Welcome back. We'll see you all later in the week.